Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today I'm finally going to be reviewing the newest album from Dream Theater, Distance Over Time. So am I the only one who feels like something weird is going on with the hype cycle for Dream Theater this time around? I mean, seriously, I know the band has been long running, and many can make the argument their last truly transcendent album was over 10 years ago, and that they've just not been the same since Mike Portnoy left, and that the vastly overproduced but kind of underwhelming 2016 project The Astonishing had pushed many of the casual fans away. But even with all of that, a new Dream Theater album didn't used to feel like a surprise that came from out of nowhere. And yet, here we are. Maybe I'm just not attuned to the hype cycle for progressive metal, but Dream Theater has just released their 14th album, and it's their shortest project since 1992's Images and Words. They've described it as a streamlined release, clocking in under an hour with only 9 songs, which for a band like Dream Theater, that matters. They'll release EPs longer than some bands' full albums. It's indeed a thing. And when you see that amount of critical acclaim this album's received, which absolutely surprised me given that Dream Theater can be a bit of a polarizing act in certain substrata of progressive metal, especially among critics, and with some of the praise now coming how accessible this album is, well, maybe the benefit of lowered expectations and won folks over? I don't know. Honestly, I didn't know what to expect with Distance Over Time. Cute way to say speed there, although the lack of direction means we're not getting any velocity. But enough bad physics jokes on my part. What do we get from Distance Over Time? Well, I'll say it. It might make for a pretty brief review, that's for damn sure. Not gonna lie, if I didn't have as much of a history with Dream Theater as I do, they very nearly made my year-end list in 2013 with that self-titled album, I probably just would have put this on the trailing edge, because it's the sort of album that doesn't really give me a lot to say. Yeah, the band went into the studio and hammered out a pretty heavy slice of progressive metal that's arguably some of their most mainstream accessible projects to date, and in a sense, that might be a major part of why it's just not clicking with me nearly as much as I was hoping it would. And this isn't coming from somebody who doesn't want to see Dream Theater to evolve or experiment. I absolutely do, but rather just more reflective of some of the issues I've been having with the current wave of progressive metal for the past decade or so. A lot of chunky, down-tuned, grinding riffs, tacked on electronic elements that don't really contribute to the melody, and then production compression at the expense of said melody. And as such, you wind up with songs that, for me, are just nowhere near as interesting or memorable as they should be. This is a good album, let me stress this, but it's just not a great one, or maybe just not for me. Now, to be fair to Dream Theater, if we're going to start this conversation with production at all, they've always had a reputation for bringing the cleanest possible tones and pickups to bear. And simply by bringing in heavier riffs and grooves, you'd think that'd be enough to get back some of that texture. Hell, they produced it themselves. Hell, there are some bass passages here that almost feel like they're pulling from funk, which is about the loosest that Dream Theater has ever been. And whether or not they did it right, I respect the experimentation. But the reason I still stick up for Dream Theater is that even with all the polish, they allowed some melodies to really come through, both in their hooks and on the solos. Just switching to more of a gent-inspired groove patterns at the expense of melodies, it somehow winds up getting the least interesting pattern of both worlds. And if you're looking for James LaBrie's singing to hold more of the melody in the meantime, he's been suffocated behind so many increasing layers of synthetic compression and electronic effects and buried partially in the mix, which only hinders the larger impact of the hooks as well. If they're trying to be accessible, this is the wrong way to do it. Coupled with a few too many passages where Mike Mangini's cymbals and snares are pushed closer to the front of the mix than they probably should be, and a few too many solos that are just kind of a pile-up of notes rather than structured in an interesting way to drive a crescendo or a melodic motif, and it's hard not to feel like on an album that's supposed to be loose and catchy, more of a collection of songs, that Dream Theater is playing against some of their strengths and kind of going in the opposite direction of what they should be. And yet, keep all this in mind, this is coming from the acknowledgement that this is a tighter and more kinetic project coming from Dream Theater in a long time. The tempos, they are quicker. The grooves, they are crunchier, and they actually sound pretty well balanced. And you dig deeply enough, you'll find some hooks here that do have some real promise. I mean, the most obvious standout for me is Barstool Warrior, where the band has described this as an obvious homage to Peter Gabriel, and you can definitely hear it with the fuzzy 80s inspired synths and the slower but more strident solos solos and a little bit more focus on melody. But you know what, on the flip side, the punchier gallop of the drums on Room 137, they had a lot of presence. Kind of expected given that Mike Mangini actually wrote that song. And I actually really liked how tightly a real melody was synchronized with the rhythm pattern on Pale Blue Dot. If more gent opted to integrate melodies in this way, I would probably like the subgenre a lot more. And you know what, there are some other passages I appreciated. The hooks behind Untethered Angel and Paralyzed, in theory they're not bad, and I like how the frustrated buildup of At Wit's End actually hits a breaking point that allows for a more spacious breather midway through, which is an apt metaphor for a lot of the song's content that we will get to. But on the flip side, you can definitely tell that songs like S2N are a little over-arranged and feel like a bit of a pile-up, especially with the inclusion of that funkier bass groove that, again, it's about the last thing that fits in with Dream Theater. I appreciate the experimentation, but it sounds like it should be part of Seinfeld. Or on the flip side, you get songs like Out of Reach that utterly lack a proper payoff melodically. I keep waiting for the solo or the strident crescendo to give the ballad any sort of real power, and while the lack of payoff might also be part of the point, it doesn't exactly make the song any better. Just saying. But you know what, going back to Barstool Warrior, what did strike me about the song was perhaps an unintentional parallel to former member Mike Portnoy's struggles with alcoholism that he chronicled extensively on a number of Dream Theater songs and albums, and that also reminded me of how much more I liked Dream Theater's lyricism when Portnoy was at the driver's seat. Now, you know what, to be fair, you can actually sketch out a broader theme across a lot of distance over time, which sketches out the open question of how much of either can be truly surpassed, how much distance can be crossed, how much time can be enough, and whether there's even enough time and chance to make that passage. So both in the very human scenes across Paralyzed, Barstool Warrior, and Out of Reach, to the possible environmental disasters on Pale Blue Dot. But very quickly you start noticing some inconsistencies in trying to celebrate that desired connection and communication crossing those boundaries, because then we get Fall Into the Light, which is all about celebrating that distance, that detached transcendence. And S2N is a switch-off song that might as well blaze its criticism of social media information overload in broad neon. I mean, I've long been tired of these songs, I've said it before, and it's not a particularly good one. And then there's At Wit's End, which James LaBrie has described as a song about the psychological weight that a woman suffers after coming under abuse and her painful struggle to recover away from it. And the song is primarily written from her new male partner's perspective. And on the one hand, it's not a terrible idea for a song in order to contextualize the helpless feeling that friends and allies and partners can feel in trying to help somebody who is closed off but truly suffering. And the moment where the patience ends and just getting the breather, that's a good point. But on the other hand, Dream Theater don't exactly approach this with a lot of tact, with the most prominent line on the hook casting the struggle coming from her possibly leaving him. I mean, his heart might be in the right place, but the execution really suffers. It just doesn't quite work. And really, that's kind of an apt consideration for the whole project. The writing is trying to tackle a couple big ideas and return to the contemporary social commentary that infused a lot of their mid-2000s work, all backed up by performances that are at their most urgent and aggressive probably since their mid-2000s work. But with a diminished focus on melody and stronger hooks along the way, the execution delivers songs that are on aggregate pretty good, but really should be a lot better. That being said, again, I think it's a good album. I think it's got a little bit more replayability than the Astonishing on the length and a lot of the production alone. And there's definitely more here that I like that I dislike. So for me, it's an extremely light 7 out of 10, and a recommendation for fans or those who prefer the modern prog metal tendencies and timbres. But beyond that, I don't know, just not a lot to say. Maybe a little bit more direction could have made this distance into displacement. That's all. So yeah, bad physics jokes aside, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. But hey, if you want to buy or stream the album, links down there below. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious how the diehard Dream Theater fans fall on this. Because again, the critics love it, but I'm just not entirely in that vein of prog metal. Again, maybe those tendencies, those tones, just not really for me. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do, I already said that. And hey, if you guys want to help, anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears for that. But hey, if you guys will actually want to help support the channel, link to my Patreon right over there. Still trying to rejigger things, but happy to hear from you. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.